Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Federation Hall on a super wet Thursday in week 11. If you haven't met me, I'm David Sequeira. I'm the director of the Fiona and Sydney Maya Gallery. It feels so funny to be saying that to this little group, but welcome everybody and welcome to all of the people in Zoom land. And before I introduce our guest speaker, I do want to take a moment and invite you all to ground yourself in the deep knowledge that long before the Victorian College of the Arts was thought of or the University of Melbourne was considered, that the Bunurong and Wurundjeri people for generations practiced song and dance. They shared stories, they made paintings and sculptures. They practiced healing on this land, and we don't take it lightly that we get to do what we get to do on this unceded land. And it really is with joy and honour that I acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. So our guest speaker today, Jason Fu, is a multidisciplinary artist whose practice brings together a wide range of sometimes contradictory references from traditional ink paintings and calligraphy to mass-produced objects, everyday vernacular to official records, personal narratives to historical events. Working across drawing, installation, painting and performance, Jason frequently uses humour as a device to explore experiences of cultural dislocation. In 2021, Jason received the Morden Family Moving Image Commission for Young Australian Artists. Most recently, Jason's work was included in Like a Wheel That Turns, the 2022 Macfarlane Commissions at the Australian Centre for Contemporary Art. And Jason's a studio resident with Gertrude Contemporary. Former. Sorry.
1 week ago.
Sorry, right. Jason was a studio resident at Gertrude Contemporary, and his exhibition, The Really Bad Day John Had, opens tonight at Gertrude Glasshouse. Wherever you are, in Zoomland or in Federation Hall, please make Jason very, very welcome.
David. That was my fault. I sent him that old bio and I need to update. So, yeah, excited to do this. Excited to be invited to do this presentation. How I normally, I guess, do these is, I guess it's a little bit dry. There's like 60 slides in this presentation, and I'll flip through them pretty quickly. And I prefer to do that and sort of talk about the overview of my sort of career from literally first year uni. It's like being stuck with someone who just been on a Europe trip and showing you a slideshow of every single slide they've done. But then to go through everything and then hopefully you guys have some profound questions which make me look really intelligent afterwards. So yeah. And I've lumped these, they're actually pretty within a timeline of first year to now, whatever, but they're also sort of lumped into the different mediums I work with as well. So I actually began as a printmaker in etching, lithography, worked in sort of a lot of different mediums and as a custom printer, but I'm going to flip through a few of these as I talk. In etching, and I've worked in Thailand making these etchings as well. A lot of them, I guess, have a lot of humor in them, you can see, if I might say so myself, but also a lot to do, I guess, my culture as a Chinese, Vietnamese, Australian, you could say, and a lot to do with animism. So I know probably don't have to explain it to you, but animism is like a lot of religion sort of cultures, a lot of folk cultures in China still follow this animist traditions, which is sort of animal worship, nature worship, being symbiotic with nature, but then having all the gods and mystical spirits and beings coming through from elements in nature, whether they're animals or trees or rocks or rivers. Yeah, there's a few etchings, a lot of references to cartoons. Feel free to interrupt as well as I'm talking. And from there, I did quite a bit of Chinese painting. So Chinese painting has its distinction from painting. I guess technically it's just watercolor, but essentially it has markers to do with the type of ink used, type of paper. Often it's rice paper, and the sort of cultural markers of Chinese painting, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, being like calligraphy, scroll formats, silk bindings, even the types of brushes used, the type of imagery and symbology, so types of animals and trees, use of negative space as well. And often the calligraphy within Chinese painting, the text you'd say is just as important, if not more important than even the figurative imagery, you know, so yeah. I translate, this is comes in a few times through my practice. I translate quite a lot of the Chinese. It's my first language, but because it's a logographic language, as in it's pictorial and each character is different, I've forgotten it since I was a kid. But whenever I retranslate it, I remember it for a little bit and then I forget again. Even my mom, who was born in China and grew up there, she's slowly losing little bits of her written vocabulary. And how I translate it is sometimes I translate it with my mom, which is a little bit of a battle because how I speak it is not perfect and she wants to translate it lyrically, but I often tell her like, oh no, but that's not how I speak. But she's like, oh, that's grammatically wrong. Or sometimes I just use Google Translate, which is a bit more truthful to how I speak than it being translated perfectly. Or sometimes I just remember how I speak and then translate it through each word one by one. Some more Chinese painting I've done. I feel like I like to, having gone through my career and realizing there are quite a lot of different ways you're perceived. This is in more of a commercial, institutional sense. I sort of not subconsciously, I think quite consciously split a lot of my practice into different avenues. So I do have what I consider quite a commercial avenue where if I'm showing with the commercial galleries I'm represented by, my practice does look a bit different. If I'm showing an institution, for me, that's an opportunity to show larger, more experimental, more conceptual work with the support of the institution. And then often I'm also asked, because of my background, to do historical based sort of projects. And this was probably one of the first ones I was ever commissioned to do, which was at Bathurst Regional Gallery, I'm pretty sure. So Sam Pu was the only known Chinese bushranger in Australia. And for this, I was paired with a historian called Meg Foster. Her thesis is on, PhD thesis, which she's just published, is on non-white, non-male bushrangers and also Indigenous bushrangers, of which there were a lot, but they weren't really reported or archived as much as white bushrangers in Australia because they were seen as outliers in the conversation and stories, and seen as one-off sort of interesting things to just publish in a newspaper once. So there's very little information about them, but she's done a really great job researching a lot of these bushrangers. So my focus on this was on Sam Pu, who allegedly killed a constable and got executed. So it's a mythical representation of his story. What I've drawn from a lot of this is the same mythical sort of representations of, and this comes into a project later, which ties into sort of Ned Kelly. Even though there's a lot of research into him, there's a lot of popular culture sort of myths that we hold on to that aren't actually true. I moved into, after I visited a show called New Ink. It was about the expanded use of Chinese painting, calligraphy within contemporary Chinese art. It's really inspired to sort of move beyond the ink and paper. So this is a sort of an expanded Chinese painting. This was for an Art Month event in Sydney. They gave me a truck and 2 helpers, and they picked up literal white pieces of trash. And I did a long landscape along the landscape, and people came and collected bits of it as well. Some other research topics. This was a failed master's thesis. I only got 2 years part-time into it. Wrote maybe like 200 words. And then they said, I don't think this is for you. But this was about, at that time, there was quite a lot of Chinese xenophobia around them buying up sort of the properties and milk powder productions and changing into milk powder production. So it was a construction site with a treasure ship that has landed on Bondi Beach. So treasure ships were a 1441 a tributary ship in China from the Zhonghe Emperor. And there's pseudo history, which is there's some evidence, but it's not considered historically accurate, that they did map out the north and east coasts of Australia in 1441, but never really landed. Yeah. Another project to do the milk production. Like I said, I'm going to go through these quite quickly because there's 60 slides. This is just some nice ceramics I made. I spent quite a lot of time in China. I won quite a large award in monetary award in Sydney, the Solomon Prize, and that allowed me to spend 2 years sort of just living in China. Sort of just experimenting with not any sort of, I'd say, high concept things, but just using spray paints and expanding sort of my installation language and just trying things which they were very supportive of. I got to do quite a few shows that were very narrative based. And this is what I've sort of gone into more later in my career after being allowed to sort of just basically do whatever I want. You know, they were like, oh, you know, a week from the exhibition, if you could just sort of tell us what's happening. That's fine, but you can do whatever you want to the space, use whatever spray paint. So I did a few of these shows, collected these doors, which these couplets appear during Chinese New Year and different festivals. But I've used funeral paper and collected old doors from a market in China and created these installations of these deaf doors. Yeah. This is at CCAS, which David, I'm sure you're familiar with. Another sort of, what I started to do, because I visited quite a few temples in China as well, and having grown up Chinese, Vietnamese, quite familiar with temples. Most of my relatives are buried there. We've got multiple festivals where we're supposed to visit our dead relatives and pray to them. So I was bringing in a lot of the aesthetics from those temples I'd seen, a lot of the formal compositions that exist within these temples and banners, and yeah, and then bring that into my own sort of narrative format. This was really fun. This is what I called like a satanic punk temple that I made in an underground car park, but a Chinese one. I'll just flip through a few of these. Started working more with different materials other than printmaking and canvas. So a lot of $2 store and Halloween store materials, I'd say. A lot of flowers and cloths I found, bamboo sticks at Bunnings, creating these sort of funeral pyres and banners for installations. This is another big banner I made, and this is when I started moving more into sort of these figurative sculptures as well that I was creating that were representative of sort of the gods, the carved wooden or ceramic gods you'd see in Chinese temples. But because I didn't have that skill set or sort of the patience to learn wood carving, which would take me many, many, many years, I started repurposing sort of Halloween skeletons and building structures around them. And that's maybe a really great thing that I did learn at art school was, I guess, being a bit more resourceful with what I had available, even what skill set I could learn within Australia. A lot of these skill sets like temple, sort of sculptural carvings, even in China, a lot of the skill set is being lost because there's not really a need to do it with machinery coming in. Yeah. So West Space, or your hometown place, you guys will be familiar with the old West Space. I got the commission there to fill the whole room. So this is the idea I was talking about with the narrative formats of sort of talking about how my parents met as my genesis, you know, the birds and the bees. My parents did meet at the fish markets in Sydney, and then drawing on the symbolism that I guess we all use in our daily lives, but how a lot of religion and cultural stories have come about. You know, they just coincidentally met there, but, you know, the fish being very culturally important to Chinese people, being a symbol of family, of prosperity, and then drawing through the Buddhist ideals that my parents very shallowly sort of hold. They're not very religious, but we do consider ourselves Buddhists. So some of the shots from there. And then these are some of the performance works I've done for 4A Centre for Contemporary Asian Art. I did do a commission for them, again, for the Landing Flat Riots, where they were the riots in 1860, just check the time. 1860, which led to the Migration and Immigration Acts, which then led to the White Australia policies, not the White Australia policy, which often people are confused about. So the Landing Flat Riots were anti-Chinese riots by European and American miners against Chinese. And then that led to taxes and immigration acts and the White Australia policies, which I'm sure everyone's very familiar about. So 4A commissioned me to do research on the original site and then create an installation, which I did with John Zerunjian, which I'm sure a lot of you guys know as well. So a lot of these performances were, again, using non-traditional instruments, a French horn, a flute, you can see with a monkey in that corner, and a snare drum. So I guess recreating temple rituals I'd seen in China, but utilizing what I could here. And that's what I find with a lot of diasporic sort of communities, and even within China, there isn't this sense of what is the proper tradition or religion. It's sort of what people have at hand. So if there needs to be a traditional drum, if they don't have that, they'll just use a handheld drum, or in this case, I'm using a snare drummer. This was a very fun performance, did with my mum. She was a theatre actor and Chinese opera singer in China pre-Cultural Revolution, and then during the Cultural Revolution, she did do some, I guess you call it revolutionary plays, but then when she came to Australia, she sort of stopped that part of her practice and just got a job doing stuff. So this was a performance commissioned by Campbelltown Arts Centre, so I thought I'd get my mum to play all the parts that she traditionally would have played, so like the demon, the empress with a live band. I'm very adverse to putting in videos into slideshows because they often don't work, but I'm happy to provide sort of links to these performances and these video works. A lot of the next few slides are video based, so it's a little bit hard to explain. this is, I guess, another stream of my practice. I don't know if you can see quotation marks in, oh, there's a video there, great. Is what I call sort of community-based parades. So the Sydney Opera House commissioned me to do a performance around the Opera House based around their Antidote Festival, which was heavily talking about climate change. So I spent 6 weeks with about 200 kids, and I ran workshops for them talking about what climate change meant to them. We did a Native and Indigenous plant workshop to talk about Native and Indigenous plants, and then we did costuming workshops. So they created all these costumes, and then these are sort of the spirits talking about how they can't fix climate change and how we as people got to fix it. So this is the spirits forming a protest, and we did talk about the ideas of protests and not specifically like how to organize and create a protest and unionizing and all that, but just, I guess what I wanted to do is for kids who hadn't been to protests before or in large parades to make them a bit more comfortable doing those things, so that in the future they were very comfortable sort of protesting when they needed and talking out when they needed. So it was also just a really fun event of them in the costumes they made in this public event, walking around the Opera House with these lion dancers in the background as well. I apologize that a lot of the last few slides don't have captions because I'm a bit of a Luddite and my computer stopped working last night and I couldn't add text in. But Rising Festival, which just happened, following a similar vein, this worked with picked a few different lead artists to work with their sort of communities, and whether that's their cultural communities, their local communities, or schools around them, to create costumes to do this parade for a moon. These are some of the costumes that were made. This ties right back into sort of the Sampu mythology. So I don't know, you guys might recognize a few of the artists here. There's Abdullah in the background there. He spent a bit of time in Melbourne. Callan J. Durr on the left, who I've got a shirt on. He's actually a rapper as well. This is sort of my cohort of artists in Sydney pretending to be sort of my version of Ned Kelly and his gang. Whereas it's Sampu, who historically did work alone, but Sampu and his gang. So the C'est la vie is what my dad used to say. Being Vietnamese, he learned French growing up. He just often say it. And the mythological thing about Ned Kelly saying such is life has been proven to be completely untrue, and is sort of tagged in with some other person that said it. But that's something we've held on to as a nation, and you'll see that in a lot of Ned Kelly tattoos. So I thought if we can lie about, you know, this, I mean, I don't think my work is talking about the sort of the heavy historical implications of colonization, but if we can lie and whitewash a lot of, you know, Ned Kelly's life, then I'm going to lie and whitewash Sampu's sort of life into this futuristic weird bushranger who's made that's supposed to be like a jade suit of armor that he's created. So, you know, haha, reference to Ned Kelly. And this is a pub I worked at. My mum and dad are in the back, so it's fun shit. Yeah, so that's the whole installation that was at Primavera. I'm going to flip through some of these. These are just my commercial practice, you know, of paintings, which still have, you know, a lot of my storytelling and language. And I find I much more enjoy doing this than thinking about the implications of working in institutions and doing a lot of the heavy research, which I still enjoy, but it's nice to sometimes just do some really nice, pretty paintings, yeah, that sell and make you money, which means you can buy nice things and pay rent and stuff, yeah. Yeah, so these are some recent paintings. some photography work I worked with. I'm really interested in the future to collaborate more within sort of photography in the fashion industry. And this is with Sly Morikara, who's a fashion photographer and an artist herself. So working with, you know, not just her as the person that presses the button, but her skill set, her aesthetic, her access to models that she knows, which creates for me a sort of curation of who's going to appear on the screen and how they appear. And even a fashion photographer's ability to communicate with their models and get them to move their body in a particular way or be in a particular place. You know, these are all skill sets which are highly valuable that I think sometimes we don't realize within collaborations. So it's just some photos. These are just the rest of the slides are some random projects I've worked with as well. So during lockdown, VR was something I worked on because obviously we couldn't sort of see each other. And the first time Rising got cancelled, Melbourne Festival got cancelled, I was supposed to do this parade. So we decided to do this internal parade online, which I did with Josh Hull from Tactical Space. So it's a completely self-generating parade of random monsters carrying random banners that are going through Chinatown in Sydney. That's not the backdrop of Chinatown. But for me, it was like, well, if we can't occupy these spaces, hopefully these spirits and demons and our ancestors can occupy these spaces while we're away. And during the Hungry Ghost Festival, which is around October and November in China, the gates of the underworld are open and our ancestors do come out and occupy the physical space. So if this was a Hungry Ghost Festival, none of you would be sitting in that front row. We'd leave the front row free for our ancestors to come and sit. They'd put on plays and musicals and the front rows would be left and food would be left out, big parades so that everyone just eat and have fun. So yeah, it's another very dark shot of that parade, which I'm pretty sure is still online. Maybe. This was my ACME commission, which decided to create what I call a Bible for. So there's a big tradition of, just seeing how I'm going for time as well. Big tradition of sort of tomes of knowledge in China, which every culture has. You know, so you got the Bible, literally. You got the Tao Te Ching in China, which is to do Taoism. So I created this sort of Kung Fu Bible. I feel like Kung Fu, yeah, did originate from a certain area, and in multiple cultures, they have their own sort of versions of martial arts. But I feel like in Australia, in Western countries, and actually all around the world, a lot of people did grow up with Kung Fu films and a lot of that sort of faux wisdom, which actually does have its roots in traditional Chinese wisdom. So, but I thought it'd be funny to grab stills from each of these random Kung Fu films. I think I watched like 200 films or something and just grab sort of slots from them and change the subtitles. Another thing growing up is often the subtitles would be wrong in the films. So I sort of created this tome of advice that you could have and take away with, and that's accessible online. So it's a 3-channel film. It's my ACA commission, created quite a depressing post-apocalyptic house, which I would have all my junk in. And I guess the work is about sort of hoarding preppers, you know. I'm sure I feel like a lot of artists are big preppers TV show fans for some reason. I feel like a lot of these preppers are sort of contemporary artists in a way, creating these little houses and collecting things. I feel like a lot of artists are hoarders. I am definitely a hoarder. A lot of this stuff around here is just stuff I've hoarded. National Geographic magazines, which I'll never read. And just little bits and bobs of plastic bottles and things like that. That's an old version of me I put inside. And this is the last couple of slides, which ties into the show that's opening tonight at Gertrude Glass House in terms of its materiality. This is how my mum would peel mandarins in one piece. My dad would peel them this way as well, put the seeds in the peels and I thought it was a really lovely way to create parchment. And then I wrote 100 sort of love poems within the peels as parchment. So love in terms of between two people, between family. And the love poems were drawn from, you know, ancient Zen poems to traditional Chinese golden era sort of poems to married at first sight quotes were in there, and I created my own poems as well. Yeah, because I feel like from the past and now, all these things encompass how we view and understand love and family. So yeah, that's it.
Thanks so much, Jason. It's just so great to get a really great overview of the diversity of your practice. We've got plenty of time for conversation. I'm just going to make sure the lights are coming on. There we are. So if anyone has a question for Jason, yeah, please. Now, we're going to do questions slightly differently today. June is going to run around with a computer so that our friends in Zoom land can hear as well.
Oh, their face is appearing in it, is it?
Oh, I should do that.
No.
No?
I just want to ask a really quick basic question. In the last slide, now echoing in here. In the last slide, the installation had what looked like a bottle at the bottom. No.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
Yeah, I just want to know is that towel and what's sitting on those towel at the bottom of the.
Oh, right, yeah, that's sort of a container of ash with incense in it, and it's a bottle of Spring Valley, but it's got ink in it. So I think this plays into sort of I think sometimes like this is now a different thing I'm going to just talk about. But I feel like a lot of young artists, and this was something I went through, especially I see young Asian artists as well who've come here or who are sort of working out their sort of ideas and what their cultural markers are, sort of tend to cling onto this idea of tradition that I'm lucky I've been back to China quite a bit since I was born, but they cling on to this idea of tradition that doesn't actually exist within the homeland or the mainland anymore. And that has evolved because, you know, people, wherever they are contemporary peoples. They don't live in a frozen moment in time. So for me, a big effort is used to sort of try and reflect how would I do this here as myself rather than use a traditional sort of object. So a lot of glass jars are used, they're repurposed, sand from Bunnings as opposed to from a proper Buddhist store, you know, incense sticks from, for some reason, newsagents often sell incense sticks. I don't know why, but from a newsagent instead of from a temple. Ink, I just used, you know, often use sort of ink from Eka leaves or whatever, as opposed to traditionally grinding the ink. I think also that isn't to say traditions don't exist and they're really important to hold on to and keep. But it is important not to get bogged down with, you know, that sort of traditional zealotism sort of thing. So that's a long answer to there's ink in there. That's what I'm saying. Yeah.
Yeah, anyone else?
Thanks, Jason. We're doing a panel this afternoon on process. So I was just wondering, I can see, I know you mentioned that you like to hoard, but also, you know, are you a studio-based artist? Does this exhibition practice drive the making? Yeah, what's some of your processes?
Yeah, I often do get asked that because I do quite a lot of projects a year. I would say this is how I do it, but we're so lucky in the arts that it is acceptable to have different ways to come to the outcome of making an artwork as opposed to other industries. So I have people who work, friends who work the complete opposite, but for me, yeah, studio, first of all, you did ask about studio practice. Because of rents issues and how expensive Sydney was, I moved from like 6 different studios in 3 years, and then there's no other 2-year program in Australia, and then the Gertrude applications came up and I applied for that. And the 2 years spent at Gertrude was really important for me just to have stability, you know. Often in Sydney, I was on month by month rents, and sometimes places didn't have running water, sometimes places didn't have toilets, sometimes places didn't have electricity. Just having a stable studio place to sort of settle. I mean, it's not even a radical idea, just it's like what we're talking about with the housing crisis here, even in Australia. So that was really important to have that 2 years to sort of solidify my practice. And I've done a lot of big shows in that last 2 years, which I probably wouldn't have been as ambitious about if I didn't have somewhere to literally even just to store things. So yeah, in terms of last 3 years as well, I've been lucky to be full-time. So as in making all my income from the arts before then was in hospitality. That makes a big difference, but it's not something which I can really tell someone to just do. But I will say that, yeah, this is a more practical thing. I would advise like to find a job if you're serious about art making that does give you that flexibility to go in residency, to you know, that doesn't work for everyone, but working in hospitality meant I could work really hard for a month and then take a week off, sort of thing, to do something. That's, you know, it doesn't work for everyone, but that's how it worked for me. And then also in terms of, I think often, sometimes my friends and I that are commercially successful get told like, oh, you're lucky that your work is commercially successful. But for us, we worked really hard to have that avenue. And it is a privilege to be able to sort of just not even need to consider that, or just focus on a part of your practice which is completely commercially unviable. But you know, everyone does things in their own way. I've started teaching as well in Sydney to sort of supplement my income, so I don't have to think about that as much. And yeah, it's this sort of big long conversation about money, which is often unfortunately a bit of a taboo in, I don't know, in Victoria, but in Sydney art schools, where it's such an important thing, and it's something that people who come from money don't have to think about. But you know, if we're living in a capitalist society at the moment and we didn't have any money to pay the rent and stuff, it's like, it's worth thinking about, hey, how do I sell a painting so I can do a big stupid installation that cost me minus $1,000, you know? Yeah, because all the installations that you see, I lost a lot of money making those, but and like I have to store this fucking thing now. So yeah, and you can't sell video work, and yeah, so VR, people don't pay you for that, but yeah. Yeah, so I don't know if that answered. Oh, do you mean my process? Yeah, sorry. I just want to talk about money because I love it so much. My process is very I guess like a lot of artists, like things sort of come to me, but then it's not, I think everyone in the world has a lot of ideas. It's not about just ideas, it's about how to make them come into fruition. And that just comes with, I think, seeing a lot of shows, and I've got a lot of friends who are very handy with tools, who I talk to very regularly. Yeah, I don't know, maybe you could ask something more specific about that. Like things just come to me, which I think it's the same for a lot of artists. I think it depends on the project. So for a historical based project, for me, ethically and morally, you do start with the research first, because that's really important, and then things come later. But if I'm doing commercial sort of painting show, I often just go back to the same reference points that I really enjoy. And I think that's really important and that give me joy. So like cartoons, this sort of traditional stories I grew up with, but also, you know, watch a lot of movies and read a lot of books and things. And a lot of poetry has come into my work because I really enjoy reading a lot of poetry. So that's a much more joyous process for me to just go, hey, I'm just going to look at things I really like and then sort of put things together. I think, unfortunately, I mean, this is something a lot of people have. I'll spend, because I am now full-time artist, I'll spend 12 hours a day sort of in the studio. If I can, 7 days a week, like I always go out and have dinner with friends and, you know, all that stuff and socialize. But if I can, whenever I can, 12 hours a week, and I probably spend 6 hours just walking around, not doing much. And this is part of a longer rant I have about, you might notice I go on tangents and rants, but about this isn't something that should just exist in the arts. Like everyone should have free time to problem solve, because that's all this making process is. It's like, oh, I've got this cool thing in my head. How do I create it into a physicality? And all that is little bits of problem solving. There's no sort of light bulb moments. It's just little things and that you're doing constantly, trying to solve and fix. And you know, it comes with like office workers should have their smoker breaks. They shouldn't have, I know this doesn't actually exist in, this only exists in one office, but they're building those toilets which are slightly slanted so that people don't spend too long on the toilet, like flipping through Instagram. It's too uncomfortable. So like it's, even when I talk to my corporate friends, they're like, yeah, I feel like I'm just doing. There's no time to sort of problem solve and create. And every industry, I think, not just the arts, needs that creativity and imagination. But in terms of, I guess more practically, that process is like, you just got to do shows. You just got to keep doing and putting yourself out there. I think there is a preciousness at the start of sort of your studies to create the most perfect thing and then show it. And that does come with, you know, confidence issues, which you have as an artist when you're younger, which I still have, but everything I create now has some part of it has been from first year, second year, third year. That's why I sometimes do show it. This is actually a school presentation for like school kids, but which I do show from the start, because you just see literally the first thing I made is almost the same as the last thing I've made, because everything's come from that before to now. All the little tips and tricks I learned has come from that. And it's come from having mentors, talking to people. It's, you know, I talk to a lot of students about sort of a lot of these key words, but in the end, it's just about community and being nice and having friends. And then you sort of build these conversations and things. And a lot of the artwork I made, I've had to ask people like, I don't know how to do this. So it's not really me that's doing it. It's just chatting to people over and over again to create it. I think there is a perception in the arts, and it's perpetuated by a lot of media where we're all these lone geniuses in our, you know, isolated mountaintop studios creating genius work. Whereas it's, yeah, it's a whole bunch of people have created all the artworks I made, sort of thing. So yeah, I couldn't have done this VR stuff, you know. But this house, my friend Shannon helped me build. Yeah, I mean, now that I've built it, I'm like, actually building a house is very simple. It's some bits of wood. Yeah.
Anyone else with a question for Jason? Yeah, please. Hold on. I know I apologize for the echo, but it just means our friends in Zoom land can hear the question.
So I have a question about the identity and the aesthetics of your work, because it seems like in your work, you don't really care about the traditional Chinese aesthetics, like the calligraphies and other things, or maybe I'm wrong. So, and you mentioned that you use the media from other resources, not the art shops, like the inks and other things. And so I'm wondering, like, do you think it's one of the way to keep the tradition? Because you are saying that the young artists nowadays in Australia, they keep thinking about identity. So I do that too. And I'm wondering how to keep the tradition of Chinese culture and stuff in overseas.
Yeah, I think it's never an either or question. It's as much as I talk about throwing away the traditions, it's like you have to learn them to throw them away first. So and a lot of my sort of confidence in shedding a lot of that actually came from spending more time in China with contemporary artists, sort of post-university. I had a few opportunities to travel there and made connections with some contemporary artists or doing residencies there. I wasn't sure about my place in that sort of scene or in terms of traditional art or whatever, but a lot of the contemporary artists I met were like, why do you even care about that stuff? And, you know, that sort of opened my eyes and like, oh, I think we sort of, and for many reasons and for many good reasons, we, as a diaspora, we care about those things more here. Whereas in China, they're like, well, we already know we're Chinese and we're just existing. Why do I have to re-Chinese myself, you know? And they're like, why do you have to do that? Why do you care about that? And so it's not as simple as that, being like, oh, just don't care about your whole identity and your upbringing. But it does come from that place where they're like, you shouldn't be bound by this thing. And tradition has always been ever evolving. So even when I talk about the calligraphy I use, you know, there's like 50 different styles, and you know, a lot of tradition has been dictated by who won a war, you know, or which weird emperor decided they wanted to wear their hair a certain way or something. So when you do look at history from that viewpoint, you're like, oh, well, how I do things as a person matters just as much, because I didn't grow up there. I grew up here, but also for me, using the other problem is I guess this comes with education of an audience, is when I use Chinese language, the work isn't about my Chinese identity. This is one of the languages I grew up with. When a Western artist uses English, people aren't like, oh, this work's about Greco-Roman Gothic calligraphy and the rise of the Roman Empire. They're like, oh, that's just English, like that's normal. You know, so for me, the language is just language I grew up with. So that is just what I am. And then maybe I'll do work that is to do with my identity or to do with this or that. So that's more of a battle you have with audiences, curators, contexts. You know, my work looks different when I exhibit in China to here or whatever. Yeah, there's no real answer to that, but it's about, yeah, I still do lots of research, and yeah, I don't, did that answer anything? Is that good? Yeah, okay.
We're gonna leave it here, but Jason, like, really just a big thank you for taking us through this whole gamut of ideas and the expanse of your practice. Thank you, and congratulations on everything, including
Thanks.
tonight's opening.
Yeah.
Please, thank you, Jason. And then a big thank you to everybody in Federation Hall and everybody in Zoom land. That wraps up Art Forum for 2022. I can't believe it's a year. Yeah, you're the last one. This is the last session. So we look forward to you joining us in 2023 for Art Forum. And you know, thanks for being with us. Cheers.